Me and my crew of the Velvet Underworld channels would fairly love to hear how things are going on at your place, or you could share it to the comment sections so that we could connect with each other. Uh, we would love to build a community of people who love touching stories about mafia bosses. Now, let's enjoy today's stories, shall we?
Lily was 23 years old, a widow, alone, with a 3-year-old son who asked for his father every night. She worked 16 hours a day just to keep her house. She barely slept. She barely ate. She never asked anyone for help. And one night, driving home from work, exhausted on a dark road, she found a man bleeding out in the cold. She did not know his name. She did not know where he came from. She did not know that this man made entire cities tremble. She only knew he was dying, so she took him home. What happened next changed everything. The wind came off the Oklahoma plains like it had a grudge. It whipped through the gaps in the trailer's aluminum siding, rattled the kitchen window that had been sealed with duct tape since November, and carried the smell of frozen earth into every corner of Lily Harper's home. She stood at the sink, scrubbing a pot that had been burned black from reheating the same batch of rice and beans for 3 days straight, and she didn't flinch. The cold was a companion now, as constant as the debt and the silence and the hollow ache behind her ribs that never quite went away. It was 11:15 at night. Her shift at the Crossroads Diner had ended at 10, but Darlene had called in sick again, which meant Lily had covered the last hour solo, bussing tables, running orders, smiling at truckers who left $2 tips on $20 tabs. Before that, she'd worked the register at the Fuel and Go from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, standing on feet that had swollen. Inside her only pair of work shoes, the ones with the sole peeling away from the left toe. Between shifts, she'd picked up Noah from Mrs. Delgado's house, the retired school teacher, 3 trailers down, who watched him for $40 a week, a price so low it constituted charity. Though neither woman would ever say so out loud, Noah was 3 years old. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, wide and watchful, the color of creek water in spring. He was asleep now in the back bedroom, the one Lily had insulated, with old blankets stapled to the walls, because the heating vent in that room hadn't worked since before Caleb died. She could hear his breathing through the thin wall, steady, trusting, the way only a child's breathing can sound. It was the only thing that kept her hands moving. The only thing that kept her standing at the sink instead of sitting on the kitchen floor and letting the silence win. Caleb Harper had been dead for 14 months, workplace accident, the report said. He'd been working a night shift at the Brewer Industrial Processing Plant 20 miles south of their trailer, operating a hydraulic press that was supposed to have been serviced 2 months prior. Something failed. The press cycled when it shouldn't have. Caleb was pronounced dead at the scene. The company's lawyers had shown up before the coroner finished, which should have told Lily everything she needed to know. But she'd been 22 years old, 8 months into widowhood before she'd even turned 23, with a toddler and no college degree and a mortgage that the bank was suddenly very interested in discussing. She hadn't gotten much. A settlement offer that barely covered the funeral and 3 months of payments. The lawyer she'd consulted, a tired man in a strip mall office in Tulsa, had told her she could fight it, that there were grounds for negligence, but the retainer alone would have cost more than she made in 4 months. She signed the papers. She buried her husband in a cemetery where the grass was brown 8 months out of 12, and she went back to work the next Monday because Noah needed diapers and the electric bill doesn't mourn. She dried her hands on a dish towel so thin she could see the overhead light through it and walked to the kitchen table. The table was small, round, bought at a garage sale for $15 when she and Caleb had first moved in. It had a wobble that Caleb had fixed with a folded piece of cardboard under one leg, and sometimes when she sat down, she'd feel the slight give and remember him on his knees, laughing, saying, "There, good as new, better than new. It's got character now." On the table were 3 envelopes. She'd sorted the mail before her shift that morning, and she'd left these 3 because they were the ones that required decisions she didn't have the energy to make at 6 a.m. The first was from First Oklahoma Savings and Trust. She didn't need to open it. The language would be polite and terrible, the way banks always managed to sound reasonable while telling you they were going to take your home. She was 2 months behind on the mortgage. The letter would mention forbearance options maybe, but those options always came with conditions that assumed she had money she didn't have. The second was from a medical billing company. Noah had gotten an ear infection in September, and the urgent care visit, the only option because she couldn't get an appointment with a pediatrician who took the state insurance she'd barely managed to qualify for, had generated a bill of $412. She'd been paying it off at $25 a month, but she'd missed November. The third was from Prescott Land Development. This one she actually opened, because it was new, and new things in this life were rarely good, but always required attention. The letter was printed on heavy stock, the kind of paper that felt like money. It informed her, in a language that was both respectful and deeply predatory, that Prescott Land Development was acquiring properties in the area for a planned residential community, and that they were prepared to make her a generous offer for her lot and any structures therein. Generous, she almost laughed. Generous for a half-acre lot with a 30-year-old trailer and a rusted propane tank and a view of nothing but grass and sky. They wanted the land. Everyone out here was hearing the same thing. Developers circling, buying up parcels, offering cash to people who were too tired to read the fine print. Some of her neighbors had already sold. The trailer park down the road was half empty now, the remaining residents holding on with the stubborn dignity of people who had nowhere else to go. She put the letter down and looked at her phone. The screen was cracked from when Noah had dropped it in the parking lot of the Fuel and Go, and it took a moment for the display to register. 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, probably the bank. They'd started calling now, not just sending letters. She could feel the tightening, the way the world was slowly constricting around her, reducing her options one by one until the only choices left would be bad ones. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to Noah's room. The door was open. She never closed it. She stood in the doorway and watched him sleep. His small hand was curled around a stuffed bear that Caleb had won at the state fair, back when they were dating, back when everything felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. The bear was missing an eye and most of its stuffing, but Noah wouldn't sleep without it. "Mama?" His voice was sleepy, half-formed. She crossed the room and knelt beside the mattress. It was on the floor now because the bed frame had broken and she couldn't afford to replace it. I'm here, baby. Go back to sleep." "Is Daddy coming home?" The question hit her the way it always did. Not like a punch, but like a slow pressure. Something compressing her chest from the inside. He asked it less frequently now, which should have been a relief, but wasn't, because it meant he was starting to forget, and that was its own kind of loss. "Daddy's watching us from far away," she said, because that was the answer she'd settled on. The one that was neither a lie nor the truth, just something a 3-year-old could hold without breaking. "Okay," Noah said, and he was asleep again before the word was fully formed. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the cold floor, listening to him breathe. The wind shook the trailer. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered, their voices thin and ancient against the Oklahoma dark. This was her life, not the life she'd imagined, not the one she'd been promised by the feeling in her chest when Caleb had first kissed her behind the bleachers at Broken Arrow High School. But it was the one she had, and she would hold it together with her hands if she had to, with her teeth, with every cell of stubbornness and love that her body could produce. She would not break. She would not beg. She would show up tomorrow at 6 a.m. and stand behind that register and smile and make change and come home and heat up rice and beans and read Noah a story and pay what she could and endure what she couldn't. That was the plan. That was every day's plan. But tomorrow night the plan would change, because tomorrow night, on the dark stretch of County Road 14, between the diner and her trailer, Lily Harper would find a man dying in the cold, And nothing, not the debt, not the silence, not the careful architecture of survival she'd built, would ever be the same. The next morning came gray and bitter. Lily woke at 5:15, the way she always did, without an alarm. Her body had been trained by necessity, the way bodies are, not gently, but completely. She lay in the narrow bed for 30 seconds, which was all the luxury she allowed herself, and listened to the sounds of the trailer settling in the cold. The pipes made a ticking noise, which meant the temperature had dropped again overnight. She'd need to let the faucets drip or risk a freeze. She dressed in the dark, jeans, thermal undershirt, the flannel that had been Caleb's. She told herself she wore it because it was warm, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that it still smelled faintly of him if she pressed her nose to the collar, and some mornings she needed that small ghost more than she needed warmth. Noah was still asleep. She heated water on the stove. The microwave had died in October, and she hadn't replaced it, and made instant coffee in a mug that said, "World's Best Dad." She drank it standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the flat, gray expanse of Oklahoma morning. The sky and the earth were almost the same color, separated only by a thin line of darker gray, where the Tuavan plains met the horizon. In the far distance, she could just make out the fence line of the tall grass prairie preserve, where the bison were. She'd taken Noah there once, last spring, and he'd stood at the fence with his mouth open, watching the massive dark shapes move across the grass like something from a dream. "Big," he'd said, "just that. Big." She smiled at the memory, and the smile hurt. The way smiles do when they're connected to something beautiful that you can't afford to feel for too long. By 5:45 she was at Mrs. Delgado's door, Noah wrapped in a blanket and still half asleep against her shoulder. Mrs. Delgado opened the door in a housecoat and slippers, her white hair loose, her face creased with the kind of warmth that comes from having raised 5 children and buried a husband, and decided that kindness was the only thing worth spending energy on. "Morning, mija. Come in, come in. Coffee's on." "I can't stay. Thank you, though." "You eat anything?" "I'm fine." Mrs. Delgado gave her a look. The look of a woman who knew what fine meant when it came from someone who was visibly not fine. But she didn't push. She took Noah gently, settling him against her shoulder with practiced ease. "He had a rough night," Lily said. Asked about his dad again. Mrs. Delgado nodded. "He'll be okay. Kids are stronger than we think." "I know," Lily said, but her voice cracked on the last word, just barely, and she turned away before Mrs. Delgado could see it. The drive to the Fuel and Go took 12 minutes on a good day, 20 in bad weather. Today it took 15 because there was ice on County Road 14, and Lily's truck, a 2008 Chevy Silverado with 240,000 miles on it, had tires that were past the point of safety and well into the territory of prayer. She drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, the heater blowing air that was cool at best, watching the road with the hyper-attention of someone who could not afford a breakdown, literally or figuratively. The Fuel and Go sat at the intersection of County Road 14 and State Highway 20, a low concrete building with 2 pump islands and a hand-painted sign that had been faded by sun and wind into near illegibility. Lily had worked there for 11 months. The owner, a man named Dale Ritter, was neither kind nor cruel. He was simply indifferent, which in an employer is sometimes the best you can hope for. He paid minimum wage, cash, off the books, which meant no taxes taken out, but also no benefits, no protections, no recourse if he decided one morning that he didn't need her anymore. She unlocked the door at 5:58, turned on the lights, started the register, and began the morning routine. Check the pumps, stock the cigarettes, wipe down the coffee station, put out the day-old donuts that a bakery in Pahuska sold them at a discount. By 6:15, the first customers started trickling in, roughnecks heading to the remaining oil jobs, ranchers in mud-caked boots, a few long-haul truckers filling up before hitting the highway. The work was repetitive and numbing, which was sometimes a mercy. Her hands moved without conscious direction, scanning items, making change, bagging purchases, while her mind cycled through the same calculations it performed every day. Mortgage, $1,140 a month, 2 months behind, plus late fees. Utilities, electric was $160, propane was another $200 in winter. Gas for the truck. Food. The medical bill. Mrs. Delgado's $40 a week. The tires that needed replacing. The cracked windshield that wouldn't pass inspection. The numbers never added up. She made roughly $2,200 a month between both jobs, sometimes a little more if tips at the diner were good. The math left her short by several $100s every month, a deficit she'd been covering by cutting everything she could: food, heat, clothing, until there was nothing left to cut. She'd sold her wedding ring in August. She'd sold the television in September. She'd sold Caleb's tools in October, which had felt like selling pieces of him, and she'd sat in the truck outside the pawn shop for 15 minutes afterward, crying into the steering wheel, before pulling herself together and driving to pick up Noah. At 2 o'clock she clocked out, drove to Mrs. Delgado's, picked up Noah, and took him home. They had an hour and a half together before she had to leave for the diner. She used it the way she always did, playing with him on the floor of the living room, reading from the same 3 picture books they owned, watching him draw with the crayons Mrs. Delgado had given him. He was drawing a house. It had a yellow sun and a green door and 2 stick figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small. "That's us?" Lily asked. "That's us," Noah confirmed, with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old artist. "It's beautiful, baby." "It has a big kitchen," he said, "for the cookies." She kissed the top of his head and held him close, and the ache in her chest was so familiar now that it felt like an organ, something vital and permanent, something she'd carry until the day she died. At 3:30, she drove him back to Mrs. Delgado's. The older woman kept him in the evenings when Lily worked the dinner shift and refused to charge extra, which was another kindness that Lily accepted with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. And then she headed to the Crossroads Diner, a flat-roofed building on the highway with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered and spelled out "Eat" in letters that looked vaguely threatening. The diner shift was harder than the gas station. She was on her feet the entire time, carrying plates, refilling coffee, memorizing orders because the pad was faster in her head than on paper. The dinner crowd was steady: families, truckers, the occasional group of teens from the high school in Pawhuska, who came for the milkshakes and left the table covered in napkin confetti. Her manager, a woman named Brenda who wore too much eyeliner and not enough patience, watched the floor like a hawk and docked tips for slow service. Tonight was busier than usual. A construction crew was staying at the motel down the road. They were part of the Prescott Development Project, someone said, surveying land for the new housing community. And they came in loud and hungry, ordering steaks and burgers and keeping Lily running for 2 hours straight. One of them, a heavy man with a sunburned neck, tried to make conversation. "Oh, what's a pretty girl like you doing in a place like this?" Lily smiled the smile she'd perfected, pleasant enough to protect the tip, distant enough to close the door. "Just working," she said, and refilled his coffee before he could say anything else. By 9:45, the diner was nearly empty. She wiped down her section, rolled silverware, cashed out her tips, $63, which was decent, and clocked out at 10. Brenda was in the back doing paperwork and didn't say goodnight, which was fine. Lily didn't need goodnight. She needed the truck to start and the road to be clear and Noah to be sleeping when she got home. The truck started on the 3rd try, which was 1 try fewer than yesterday, so she counted it as a win. She pulled out of the diner parking lot and turned onto County Road 14, the headlights cutting 2 weak beams into the darkness. The road was empty. It was always empty at this hour, a 2-lane strip of cracked asphalt running through open grassland. No street lights, no houses for the first 4 miles, nothing but the dark and the wind and the occasional pair of animal eyes glowing in the brush. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read 21 degrees. The heater was working tonight, sort of, blowing air that was slightly warmer than the outside, which on a night like this constituted a miracle. She drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes focused, mind already running through tomorrow's schedule. 6 a.m. shift. Noah's cough. Was it getting worse? She needed to call the clinic. The mortgage. Always the mortgage. She almost missed him. The headlights caught something at the edge of the road, just past the old grain silo that marked the halfway point between the diner and her trailer. Her first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote. Oklahoma was full of things that wandered onto roads at night, things that were just trying to get from one side of the dark to the other. But it wasn't an animal, it was a man. He was lying in the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road, half on the gravel shoulder, half in the frozen grass. He was on his side, one arm extended, as if he'd been reaching for the road when his body gave out. His clothes were dark, she couldn't tell the color, and he wasn't moving. Lily's foot came off the gas and hovered over the brake. The truck slowed, her hands tightened on the wheel. Every instinct that had been sharpened by a year of survival alone told her the same thing. Keep driving. It's not your problem. You have a son at home. You have enough problems of your own. Call 911 if you want, but keep driving. She slowed to a crawl. In the headlights, she could see more detail now. The man was tall. His clothes were expensive. She could tell even at a distance, the way you can always tell expensive clothes from cheap ones, by the way they hang, the way they catch light. He was wearing a suit jacket, which was insane for a freezing night on a rural Oklahoma road. His shoes were leather. His hand, the one extended toward the road, was covered in something dark. Blood. The word arrived in her mind with clinical clarity. That's blood. She stopped the truck. The engine idled. The headlights pinned him in a pool of white light, and he still didn't move. Don't do this, she said out loud to herself, to the empty cab, to whatever instinct was pulling her toward the door. Do not do this. She picked up her phone. The screen glowed in the dark. She could call 911. The dispatcher would send an ambulance from Pawhuska. 30 minutes, maybe 40 in this weather. The man might be dead by then. Or he might not be. Either way, it wouldn't be her problem. She'd done her part. She'd called. Her thumb hovered over the 9. But she could see his back moving, barely, a shallow rise and fall that meant he was breathing, which meant he was alive, which meant he was dying, right there, 15 feet from her truck, in the kind of cold that killed healthy people in hours and would kill an injured man much faster. Damn it, she whispered. She put the truck in park, left the headlights on, grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, a heavy mag light that Caleb had kept there, which also served as a weapon if it came to that, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. She crossed the road in quick steps, the gravel crunching under her shoes, and knelt beside the man. He was alive. His breathing was ragged, each exhale visible in the frozen air, short puffs of vapor that dissipated instantly. His face was turned away from her, pressed into the grass. She reached out and touched his shoulder, gently, and he didn't respond. Hey, she said. Hey, can you hear me? Nothing. She rolled him onto his back carefully, the way she'd learned in the CPR class she'd taken at the community center when Noah was born. And that was when she saw it. The blood was coming from his left side, just below the ribs. His shirt, white or it had been white, was soaked through, the fabric clinging to the wound. It wasn't a cut. It wasn't a laceration from a fall or a car accident. It was a hole, small, round, clean around the edges, ragged underneath, where something had torn through him and come out the other side. A bullet wound. Lily's hands went still. The flashlight beam shook slightly, and she steadied it with an effort of will. She had never seen a gunshot wound in person, but she'd grown up in rural Oklahoma, where hunting was a way of life, and gun safety was taught alongside the alphabet, and she knew what a bullet hole looked like. Her eyes moved to his face. He was maybe mid-30s, dark hair, cut short, strong features, the kind of face that photographed well, that belonged on someone important. A scar along his jawline, thin and old, and on his wrist, the one that had been reaching for the road, a watch, not a normal watch, the kind of watch that cost more than her truck and her trailer combined. Who was this man? Her mind produced answers, none of them good. A man in expensive clothes with a bullet wound on a rural road at 11 o'clock at night. He hadn't been hunting. He hadn't been in a car accident. There was no car in sight, no headlights, no evidence of anything, except that someone had shot him and left him here to die. She should leave. She should call 911 and leave. She should... He opened his eyes. They were dark, dark brown, almost black, and even in the delirium of blood loss and hypothermia, they were focused. For 1 second, one terrible, electric second, he looked at her, and Lily felt something she hadn't felt since the night the police came to her door about Caleb. She felt the presence of a world that much larger and much darker than the one she inhabited, pressing against the edges of her reality, trying to get in. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was unconscious again, and the moment passed, and she was just a woman kneeling on a frozen road beside a dying stranger. She had a choice. Later she would think about this moment constantly, replaying it, examining it, trying to understand why she'd done what she'd done. She was a practical woman, a careful woman, a woman who locked her doors and kept a loaded shotgun under her bed and had been raising a child alone in the middle of nowhere for over a year. She was not reckless. She was not naive. She did not take in strangers, especially strangers who had been shot, especially strangers who looked the way this man looked, like someone who lived in a world where people got shot. But she also knew what it was to be alone in the cold, with no one coming. She knew what it felt like when the world looked away. She stood up, walked back to the truck, and lowered the tailgate. Then she returned to the man, hooked her arms under his shoulders, and began to drag him. He was heavy, at least 200 pounds, most of it muscle, and she was 125 pounds of exhaustion. But she'd spent the last year lifting 50-pound propane tanks and hauling garbage bags to the dump and carrying a 35-pound toddler on her hip for hours at a time, and she was stronger than she looked, stronger than she knew. It took 4 minutes to get him into the truck bed. She was panting, her arms trembling, her flannel soaked with his blood from where she'd pressed against his side. She laid him as flat as she could, covered him with the moving blanket she kept behind the seat, and closed the tailgate. Then she got back in the cab and sat there for 10 seconds, breathing. "What are you doing?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, the kind a person makes when they watch themselves. Doing something they know is probably a mistake, but are going to do anyway because the alternative, driving away, leaving a man to freeze to death on a road where no one else would come until morning, was something they couldn't live with. She put the truck in gear and drove home. The trailer had never felt smaller. She'd gotten him inside, a process that involved determination, adrenaline, and a sequence of movements that would leave her back aching for days, and laid him on the couch, which was really more of a love seat, too short for his frame, his feet hanging over the armrest. She'd peeled back his shirt and looked at the wound in the overhead light of the living room, and what she saw told her 2 things. First, the bullet had gone clean through, entering below his left ribs and exiting through his back, which meant it probably hadn't hit any major organs. Second, he'd lost a lot of blood, more than she'd thought. The left side of his pants was soaked, and the moving blanket she'd wrapped around him was already stained through. She wasn't a doctor, she wasn't even a nurse, but she'd grown up on a ranch before her parents lost it, and she'd watched her father stitch up gored horses and set broken bones on cattle, and she'd absorbed more about wound care than she'd ever expected to need. She also had a first aid kit, a good one, military grade, that Caleb had bought online because he was the kind of man who prepared for things, and she got it from the closet above the bathroom and laid it out on the kitchen table. She cleaned the wound with saline and antiseptic. She packed it with gauze. She applied pressure bandages to both the entry and exit wounds, securing them with medical tape. She checked his pulse, rapid but present. His skin was cold but not blue. His breathing was shallow but steady. Then she did the thing she knew she should have done first and didn't. She searched him. His wallet was in his inside jacket pocket. It was black leather, thin, expensive. She opened it and found $600 in cash, hundreds, all new and crisp, and a driver's license issued in New York State. The name on the license was Michael Torres. The photo matched the face on her couch. The address was somewhere in Manhattan. New York. A man from New York, in a suit with a bullet wound, on a back road in rural Oklahoma. The story was not adding up, and Lily didn't need it to add up. She needed him to survive the night, and then she needed him to leave. In his pants pocket, she found a phone. Not a regular phone, a small black device with no brand markings, no apps visible on the lock screen, just a keypad and a timer that was counting upward. A burner phone. She'd seen enough crime shows to recognize one. In his other pocket, a set of car keys, not for a truck or a sedan, but for something expensive. She could tell by the weight of the key fob, the embossed logo she didn't recognize. Nothing else. No credit cards, no business cards, no photographs. Just cash, a fake-looking ID, a burner phone, and keys to a car that was somewhere else. She put everything on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair across from the couch. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off, the reality settling in. There was a man bleeding on her couch, a man who had been shot, a man carrying a fake ID and a burner phone and more cash than she made in 2 weeks. Noah was asleep 20 feet away, behind a door so thin you could hear a whisper through it. She should call the police. She picked up her phone, and this time she actually dialed 911 and stopped. Because here's the thing about calling the police when you're a young woman alone with a child in a trailer on the edge of nowhere. The police would come. They would see the man. They would ask questions. They would search her home, the home of a woman who'd brought a shooting victim inside rather than calling for help, which would look suspicious. They would find the shotgun under her bed, which was legally owned but which would raise eyebrows. They would involve child services maybe, because that's what happens when you have a child and a bleeding stranger in the same 30-foot trailer. They would take Noah to a foster home while they sorted it out, just temporarily, just as a precaution, and Lily Harper would die before she let anyone take Noah. She put the phone down. She checked the man's bandages, adjusted the blanket over him, and sat in the kitchen chair with the mag light in her lap and the shotgun leaning against the wall within arm's reach, and she waited. He woke at 4:17 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she was looking at the clock on the microwave, the broken microwave whose clock still worked, one of those absurd details that life specializes in, when she heard him move, not a groan, not a thrash. A controlled shift, almost silent, the kind of movement made by someone who was accustomed to waking in unfamiliar places and needed to assess the situation before revealing consciousness. She watched him. He didn't open his eyes right away. First, his breathing changed. It had been the slow, heavy rhythm of unconsciousness, and now it tightened, becoming shallow and deliberate. His fingers moved, testing the surface beneath them, registering the couch fabric. His hand traveled to his side, found the bandage, paused, cataloging, processing. Then he opened his eyes, the same dark eyes she'd seen on the road, but different now, clear, alert. They moved around the room with a speed and precision that made her skin prickle. She watched him take in the space in what felt like a single second. The door, 12 feet to his left, locked with a deadbolt and a chain. The windows, 2 of them, one sealed with tape, the other curtained. The kitchen, behind and to his right. The hallway, leading to the back bedrooms. The woman sitting in the chair with a flashlight in her lap and a shotgun against the wall. He looked at the shotgun. Then he looked at her. "Where am I?" His voice was low, rough, scraped clean of everything except the essential question. "My home," Lily said. "I found you on County Road 14 about 5 hours ago. You'd been shot." He processed this. His expression didn't change. It was like watching someone read a report, clinical and detached. But she saw something shift behind his eyes, a rapid recalculation of circumstances. You brought me here. Yes. Did you call anyone? No. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze steadily, which cost her more than she would have admitted. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't name. Not menace exactly, but a density, a weight, the kind of compressed intensity that she imagined you developed when your life depended on reading people accurately in the space of a heartbeat. Why not? He asked. Because I have a 3-year-old asleep in the next room, and I don't need police in my house at midnight, asking questions I don't have answers to. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the absence of the answer he'd expected. Your son. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. His hand was still on the bandage, pressing lightly, gauging the damage. You cleaned the wound. I did what I could. You need a hospital. No hospital. You've been shot. I'm aware. The faintest trace of something that might have been dry humor, though his face gave nothing away. No hospital. They report gunshot wounds. I know they do. That's generally the point. He looked at her again, and this time there was something new in his gaze, a kind of recalibration, as if he'd initially assessed her as one thing and was now revising that assessment upward. She was not cowering. She was not panicking. She was sitting in a chair with a flashlight and a shotgun and speaking to him like a nurse with a difficult patient, and that was clearly not what he'd expected. I need to make a call, he said. Your phone's on the table. He turned his head and saw it, the burner phone next to his wallet and keys. His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. You went through my things. You were unconscious and bleeding on my couch. Yes. I went through your things. She paused. Michael Torres from Manhattan. Except that's not your name, is it? He didn't answer. You don't have to tell me your name, she said. You don't have to tell me anything, but here's how this is going to work. You're going to stay on that couch until you can walk, and then you're going to leave. In the meantime, you're not going to make trouble, you're not going to bring trouble, and you're not going to go anywhere near my son. Are we clear? The silence that followed was absolute. The trailer creaked in the wind. The clock on the broken microwave ticked from 4:19 to 4:20. Clear, he said. She stood, walked to the kitchen table, and brought him the phone, a glass of water, and 2 ibuprofen from the first aid kit. He took all 3 without comment. She watched him dial a number from memory, not from the phone's contacts, from his memory, and hold the device to his ear. It rang twice. It's me, he said, and then he spoke in a language that wasn't English. Italian, she thought, clipped, rapid, authoritative despite the weakness in his voice. The conversation lasted less than 40 seconds. He ended the call, removed the SIM card from the phone, and snapped it in half with his fingers. Then, he set the broken pieces on the arm of the couch and looked at the ceiling. Lily stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. You just destroyed the only phone you had, she said. It's compromised. So how will your people find you? He turned his head toward her. They won't. That's the point. She waited for more. He offered nothing. The silence stretched between them like the Oklahoma plains themselves, vast and empty and giving nothing away. I'm going to check on my son, she said. There's more water in the kitchen. Don't bleed on my couch. She thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Not a smile. Not yet. Just the ghost of one, passing through. She checked on Noah. He was still asleep, curled around his bare, mouth slightly open, completely unaware that there was a stranger in the next room and that his mother's hands were stained with someone else's blood. She watched him for a long time, until the sky outside the window began to lighten, from black to charcoal. And then she went back to the kitchen to start making coffee, because in 4 hours she had to be at work, and the world did not pause for bullet wounds, or moral reckonings, or the small, terrified voice in the back of her mind that was asking what she had done. The next 2 days existed in a state of suspended tension, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the air itself holds its breath. He slept most of the first day. His body was doing what bodies do after severe trauma. shutting down all non-essential systems and redirecting everything toward repair. She checked his wound before leaving for work, changed the bandages, left water and crackers on the coffee table. When she came home between shifts to pick up Noah, the crackers were untouched and the water was half gone. Noah saw him. This was the part she'd dreaded. She'd told herself she could keep them separate, the man on the couch and the child in the back bedroom. But a trailer is not a house, and a 3-year-old is not governable in the way that logistics require. Noah came out of his room at 6:30 in the morning, padding down the hall in his pajamas, and stopped dead when he saw the man on the couch. He stood in the hallway, clutching his bear, staring with the wide, unfiltered gaze of a child for whom the world still consisted, primarily of things he hadn't seen before. "Mama," he said, not scared, just informational. "There's a man." Lily was in the kitchen. She came around the corner, drying her hands, her heart doing something fast and uncomfortable. "I know, baby. He's sick. He's resting." "Is he going to be okay?" "Yes, but we need to let him sleep, all right? Come on, breakfast." Noah looked at the man for another long moment, then followed his mother into the kitchen. But at the doorway, he stopped and turned back. "He doesn't have a blanket," he said. Lily opened her mouth to say that the man had a blanket, that she'd covered him, but Noah was already gone, toddling down the hall to his room. He came back 30 seconds later with his own blanket, the blue one with the fraying edge, the one he slept with every night, and carried it to the couch. He couldn't reach high enough to cover the man properly, so he laid it across his feet, carefully, the way children handle things they consider important. Then he went to the kitchen for breakfast and didn't mention it again. Lily stood in the hallway, watching, and she felt something crack inside her. Not break, not shatter, just crack, the way a dam cracks before it gives way. And for a moment, the full weight of everything she'd been carrying pressed against the fissure, and she had to put her hand on the wall to keep standing. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in 3 months, and she wasn't going to start now because her son was kind. The man's eyes were open. She hadn't noticed him wake, but he was looking at Noah's blanket on his feet, and his expression, for the first time since she'd found him, was not controlled. Something had slipped through, something raw and unguarded, there and gone in an instant, like a fish breaking the surface of still water. He looked at Lily. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. She took Noah to Mrs. Delgado's and went to work. On the 2nd day, he was able to sit up. On the 3rd, he stood. She came home from the gas station shift to find him on his feet in the kitchen, gripping the counter with one hand, his jaw clenched against the pane, examining the room with the methodical attention of someone cataloging assets and vulnerabilities. He'd found the foreclosure notice. It was on the counter where she'd left it, next to the letter from Prescott Land Development, and he was reading it when she walked in. He set it down when he saw her, but not quickly, not guiltily. He set it down the way a person sets down a piece of evidence they've already committed to memory. "You shouldn't be standing," she said. "I shouldn't be here at all." "We agree on that. Sit down before you rip your stitches." She paused. "I mean the bandage. I didn't stitch you. You should have. You want me to poke holes in you with a sewing needle? I have one. It's got little flowers on the handle." That almost smile again. He sat, slowly, carefully, lowering himself into the kitchen chair with the controlled precision of someone who was intimately familiar with pain, and had long ago decided not to show it. "I need to stay 1 more day," he said. "Maybe 2. Then I'll be gone and you'll never see me again." "That's what you said yesterday." "Yesterday I couldn't stand. And today you can barely sit." He looked at her. She was standing by the sink, still in her Fuel and Go polo, her hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like what she was, a woman running on willpower and caffeine, holding a life together with both hands. "You're not going to ask me what happened," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because whatever you tell me is either going to be a lie or something I'm better off." Not knowing, and I don't have time for either. He studied her, that assessing gaze again, the one that felt like it could read the serial numbers on her thoughts. You're smart, he said. I'm tired, she corrected. There's a difference. She opened the fridge. He watched her open it, and she knew he'd already seen inside it. The bare shelves, the half-gallon of milk, the block of government cheese, the eggs, the container of leftover rice. She knew because when she opened it, something shifted in his posture, a slight tension that could have been judgment, or could have been something else entirely. She made 2 plates, scrambled eggs with cheese, the last of the bread toasted. She put one in front of him without asking if he was hungry. You don't have to feed me, he said. You lost about a pint of blood on my couch, which I can't replace. The least you can do is eat my eggs. He ate. She noticed that he waited until she'd sat down and started eating before he began. A faute, habit, she thought, or a courtesy, or both. He ate slowly, methodically, without pleasure, but with efficiency, the way a machine takes fuel. When he finished, he set the fork down parallel to the knife and looked at the empty plate. Thank you, he said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, not the language. He spoke English perfectly, with an accent she couldn't quite place, something that lived beneath the words rather than on top of them. But the concept, as if gratitude were a currency he rarely traded in. You're welcome, she said, and cleared the plates. That night, after her diner shift, she came home to find Noah asleep in his room, and the man, she still didn't know his name, and she'd stopped asking. Sitting on the couch in the dark, he wasn't sleeping, he was listening. She could tell by the angle of his head, the stillness of his body, the way his eyes reflected the faint light from the kitchen. He had a nightmare, he said as she closed the door behind her. Lily froze. What? Your son. About an hour ago. He called out. I didn't go in. He added quickly, reading the alarm on her face. I stayed on the couch. He settled after a minute or two. She stood there, keys in her hand, coat still on, processing. The thought of this man, this stranger, this man with a bullet wound, and a burner phone and a fake ID, hearing her son's nightmares in the dark of her home was almost too much to hold. He has them sometimes, she said quietly, since his father died. I know what nightmares sound like, he said, and the way he said it made her think he wasn't talking about children. She hung up her coat, checked on Noah. He was sleeping peacefully, the one-eyed bear tucked under his chin, and came back to the living room. She sat in the kitchen chair, which she'd moved to face the couch. The distance between them was 6 feet, the length of the room, the widths of 2 entirely different lives. Matteo, he said. She looked at him. My name. It's Matteo. She waited. Matteo Rossi. Is that your real name? Yes. Not Michael Torres? Michael Torres doesn't exist. I figured. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. Why are you telling me now? Because you fed me, because your son gave me his blanket, because you haven't called the police, or asked me for money, or tried to leverage this situation, and in my experience, that doesn't happen. In your experience, she repeated. What kind of experience is that? He didn't answer for a long time. The wind was doing its usual work on the trailer, finding gaps, making its presence known. Outside, the sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only got in places where the darkness was real, where the nearest city lights were 50 miles away. The kind that ends with people bleeding on roads in Oklahoma, he said. She nodded. She didn't push. She'd meant what she said about not wanting to know, and she still meant it mostly. But the name, giving her his real name, had shifted something. It was an act of trust, and trust was a currency she understood. It was the most valuable thing a person could offer, and the most dangerous. Lily, she said. Lily Harper. I know, he said. I saw the foreclosure notice. The next day, things changed. She came home from her morning shift to find the kitchen clean. Not just tidy, clean. The dishes she'd left in the sink were washed and stacked. The counter was wiped down. The floor had been swept. And on the kitchen table, where the foreclosure notice and the medical bills and the letter from Prescott had been stacked, there was nothing. He'd moved them, she realized, not thrown them away, but gathered them into a neat pile and placed them on the shelf above the coat hooks, as if removing them from sight was the only help he could offer. She found him on the back step, sitting in the cold, looking at the plains. The bison preserve was visible in the distance, a dark line of fence against the brown grass. He was wearing Caleb's old jacket. She'd given it to him because his suit jacket was ruined by blood, and the only other coat in the house was her own, and he looked strange in it, like a man wearing a costume that was both too small and too big at the same time. "You cleaned my kitchen," she said. "I needed to move. Staying still too long is a risk. A risk for your recovery or a risk in general?" He looked at her. "Both." She sat down on the step beside him, leaving a foot of space between them. The cold bit through her jeans immediately, but she stayed. Below them, the land stretched flat and open to the horizon, nothing moving except the grass and the wind. "Those people who shot you," she said, "are they looking for you?" "Yes." "Will they look here?" "Not if I leave in time." "And if you don't?" He didn't answer, and the silence was more honest than any answer would have been. That night she found the second phone. She'd gone to change his bandages. The wound was closing, impossibly fast, the kind of healing she associated with bodies that had been conditioned by discipline and damage. And while she was applying the new gauze, she noticed a lump in the lining of his jacket. The Caleb's jacket, but the lining of his own ruined suit jacket, which she'd hung in the closet to deal with later. She wouldn't have noticed it at all except that the fabric had dried stiff with blood, and the lump was more pronounced than it would have been in soft cloth. She looked at him. He was watching her hands on the bandage, his expression neutral. "There's something in your jacket lining," she said. His expression didn't change, but something in his body tightened, a subtle shift in the musculature of his shoulders that told her everything. The expression didn't. "It's not relevant to you," he said. "Everything in my house is relevant to me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out, took the jacket from the closet door, and pulled a second phone from the lining. Smaller than the first, newer, its screen intact. "Encrypted," he said. "Untraceable, for emergencies." "This isn't an emergency. This is a complication. An emergency would involve other people being here." She sat back on her heels. The bandage was done. He was shirtless, and she was kneeling in front of him, and the intimacy of the position struck her suddenly, not sexually, but spatially. How close they were, how his skin was warm under her fingers, how she could see the other scars on his body, a map of violence drawn on his torso in raised white lines and faded marks. She stood up. "Mateo." He looked up at her. "Who are you, really?" The question hung in the air. She'd said she wouldn't ask. She'd meant it, but 3 days of proximity had eroded the wall she'd built between curiosity and caution, and Noah's blanket on his feet, and the clean kitchen, and the way he'd listened to her son's nightmares without. Moving from the couch had done something to her defenses that she hadn't given them permission to do. He stood. The movement cost him. She could see it in the flex of his jaw, the controlled exhale. But he stood, and at his full height, he was several inches taller than her, and the room felt different with both of them standing in it. "I'm the reason you should have kept driving that night," he said. "That doesn't answer my question. It's the only answer I can give you that won't put you in more danger than you're already in." "I'm already in danger. You have been since you pulled me off that road." The words settled over the room like snow. Quiet, cold, accumulating. She felt them land on her shoulders, on the back of her neck, on the soft tissue of every fear she'd been suppressing since she saw the blood on his shirt. "Ah, then you owe me the truth," she said. "Not all of it, just enough so I know what I'm dealing with." He was quiet for a long time. She could see him, calculating, not emotionally, but strategically, weighing risks, measuring outcomes, running scenarios. It was the kind of thinking that happened behind eyes that had been trained to never show the process, and she watched it without flinching. "I run a logistics operation," he said finally. Import, export, distribution, goods, transportation, routes. I control a network that stretches from the East Coast to the Midwest. Logistics, she repeated. Is that a euphemism? It's a simplification. What kind of goods? The kind that require people to shoot at me when negotiations break down. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that might have been concern, or might have been the awareness that he was watching someone absorb information that would change the shape of their reality. So I'm a businessman, he said, with a wider definition of business than most. You're in the Ike Mafia. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He stood there in her dead husband's jacket, in her 30-foot trailer, on the edge of the Oklahoma plains, and let the silence speak for itself. You need to leave, she said. I know. Tomorrow. I'll try. Not try. Tomorrow. He nodded. Once, a man accustomed to agreements that were sealed with less. She turned away, walked to Noah's room, and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the mattress and watched her son sleep, and the ache in her chest was different now, sharper, edged with something she recognized as fear, but also something else, something she was not ready to name, something that had no business existing in a situation like this, and yet there it was, stubborn and uninvited, like a weed growing through concrete. He didn't leave the next day. Not because he chose to stay, but because his body chose for him. The wound, which had been healing, became inflamed overnight, an infection settling into the exit wound, turning the skin around it hot and red and angry. By morning his temperature was 102, and his face, which had been regaining color, was pale again, sheened with sweat. She found him on the couch at 5 a.m., conscious but obviously unwell, his jaw clenched against a fever he was trying to will away through sheer stubbornness. You're burning up, she said. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. I'm an excellent liar. I'm just not lying about this. You have a fever of 102. The wound is infected. You need antibiotics. I don't need a hospital. I didn't say hospital. I said antibiotics. She paused, thinking. There's a veterinary supply store in Pahuska. They sell penicillin over the counter. It's for livestock, but it's the same compound. He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You're going to treat me with horse antibiotics. I'm going to treat you with the only thing I can get without a prescription, a copay, or an explanation, unless you want to die of sepsis on my couch, in which case the cleanup will be significantly more complicated. Go, he said. She went. She drove to Pahuska, bought a bottle of injectable penicillin and a pack of syringes from the farm supply section of the True Value, and drove back. She calculated the dose based on a formula she'd learned from her father, adjusted for human body weight, and administered the injection in his upper arm while he sat on the couch and watched her with eyes that were too bright with fever. But still, she gave him the injection, covered him with blankets, including Noah's blue one, which the boy insisted be included, and went to work with antibiotic protocols running through her head, alongside the mortgage calculations and the tip projections and the slowly growing realization that this man was not going to be gone in a day or two, and that every hour he stayed in her home was an hour in which the world he came from might reach into the world she'd built and tear it apart. The infection broke on the 5th day. The penicillin did its work. The fever receded like a tide pulling back from shore, and Matteo Rossi began to heal in earnest. His body was efficient at recovery. She could see it in the way the wound knitted, in the way color returned to his face, in the way his movements became less guarded and more fluid with each passing hour. Whatever life he'd lived had built a body that knew how to take damage and rebuild, and she found herself watching the process with the clinical interest of a woman who spent most of her time holding things together with duct tape and prayer. By the 6th day, he could walk without gripping furniture. By the 7th, he was moving around the trailer with a quiet deliberateness that reminded her of a large animal in a small cage, not agitated exactly, but contained, compressed. A man whose natural habitat was much larger than these walls, pacing the boundaries of a space that was never meant to hold someone like him. He watched everything. That was the thing she noticed most. Not in the way of a guest, politely, peripherally, but in the way of someone for whom observation was survival. He watched the way she prepared food, stretching portions, diluting soup, cutting bread thin. He watched the way she counted the bills and her tip money, sorting them on the table with the grim precision of a field surgeon triaging patients. He watched the way she layered blankets on Noah's bed instead of turning up the heat, the way she wore Caleb's flannel because she couldn't afford a new coat, the way she checked the propane gauge every morning with the barely concealed anxiety of a woman who knew the tank was low and the refill was $200 she didn't have. He said nothing about any of it. Not at first. But on the 7th morning she woke to find groceries on the kitchen counter. Not the kind of groceries she bought, the institutional-sized cans of beans, the generic bread, the store-brand cheese. These were different. Milk, eggs, fresh vegetables, peppers, tomatoes, spinach, a whole chicken. Fruit, actual fruit, apples and bananas, and a container of strawberries that must have cost $5 alone. There was cereal for Noah, the good kind, with the cartoon tiger on the box. There was coffee, real coffee, not the instant powder she'd been drinking. There was bread from a bakery, dense and brown and still warm. She stood in the kitchen and stared at it, and the feeling that moved through her was complex enough to have its own gravitational field. Gratitude and shame and anger and relief, all of it tangled together, all of it pressing against the walls of the composure she'd spent 14 months building. He was on the back step again, drinking. Coffee. He'd made it himself, in the percolator Caleb had bought years ago, and looking at the plains. The morning was cold, but clear, the sky enormous and blue, the kind of sky that made the flatness of Oklahoma feel like a feature rather than a deficiency. "I didn't ask for this," she said from the doorway. He didn't turn around. "I know. Where did you get the money? The $600 in your wallet?" "That money is mine. It's clean." A pause. "Clean enough." "I don't want your money." Now he turned. "It's not money. It's food. Your refrigerator had eggs and government cheese. Your son ate cereal with water this morning because you're almost out of milk." The accuracy of the observation hit her like a slap. He'd seen. Of course he'd seen. He saw everything. "That's not your concern," she said, and her voice was harder than she meant it to be, sharpened by the particular shame of having your poverty witnessed by someone who clearly existed in a different economic universe. "You're right," he said. "It's not. But I'm eating your food and sleeping on your couch, and your son gave me his blanket, and if I walk out of here in 2 days and leave you with an empty kitchen, then whatever I am, I'm also the kind of man who takes from a woman who has nothing. And I won't be that." She opened her mouth to argue. She had arguments, good ones, about pride and independence, and not accepting things from strangers, especially strangers who ran logistics operations that involved people shooting at them. But the words dissolved before they reached her tongue, because the truth was simple and brutal. She was hungry, Noah was hungry, and the strawberries on the counter were the most beautiful things she'd seen in months. "Thank you," she said, and the words cost her something, but less than she'd expected. He nodded and turned back to the plains. She went to work. When she came home between shifts, Noah was playing on the floor of the living room while Mateo sat at the kitchen table, and there was something on the table between them that she didn't immediately recognize. It was a house, a small house made of playing cards, one of the old decks from the kitchen drawer, missing the 6 of diamonds and the Queen of hearts, constructed with an architectural precision that was almost absurd. It had 3 stories, a peaked roof, and a front porch made from 2 cards leaning against each other at exactly the right angle. Noah was watching it with reverent attention. "Mama, look, he made a house." Mateo didn't look up. His hands were steady, placing another card on the structure with the careful focus of a man who was accustomed to building things that could collapse at any moment. "It needs a kitchen," Noah said. "It does," Mateo agreed, his voice quiet. stripped of the hard edges she'd heard when he spoke to her about guns and logistics and danger. A big kitchen. For the cookies, Noah explained. Of course, for the cookies. Lily stood in the doorway and watched a Mafia boss build a card house for her son, and the crack in her chest, the one that had appeared when Noah laid his blanket on a stranger's feet, widened another fraction of an inch, and the thing behind it pressed closer to the surface, and she turned away before it broke through. It wasn't until the 8th day that she understood the full scope of what he'd been doing. She came home from the diner at 10:15, exhausted in the cellular way that came from standing for 16 hours on shoes that didn't fit, and found Mateo at the kitchen table with the encrypted phone in his hand and a look on his face that she'd never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, something quieter, something that looked, possibly, like guilt. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong. You're sitting in my kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with the same expression my husband used to get when he'd done something he knew I wouldn't like." "What did you do?" He set the phone down. He looked at her with that direct, unblinking gaze that she'd stopped being intimidated. They'd be by somewhere around day 5 when she'd watched him try to open a can of soup with one hand and failed twice before accepting her help. "I made some calls," he said. "On the encrypted phone you said was for emergencies. This qualifies." "What qualifies?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, not evasive, but precise, the way a person speaks when they're delivering information they've calculated the impact of in advance. "The company that holds your mortgage, First Oklahoma Savings and Trust, is a subsidiary of a holding group called Kessler Financial. Kessler Financial has a silent partner who owes me a significant favor. As of this afternoon, your mortgage is current. The 2 months of arrears have been cleared, and your interest rate has been adjusted to something that reflects the current market, rather than the predatory rate you were locked into." The words entered her ears and rearranged the furniture of her reality. "You... what?" "The medical bill from your son's urgent care visit has been settled, the full amount. The collection agency has been instructed to close the account." She put her hand on the counter. "The land development company, Prescott, that's been pressuring you. I looked into their permits. Half of them are pending approval from a county board that includes a man who has done business with associates of mine. The board will approve the permits, but Prescott has been informed that your property is not available for acquisition. They'll redirect their development plan around your parcel." "Stop," she said. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the broken microwave said 10:22. Noah was asleep. The wind was doing its thing, and Lily Harper was standing in her kitchen, being told that a man she'd pulled off a frozen road 8 days ago had from her couch dismantled the financial architecture of her suffering with a few phone calls. "You had no right," she said. "No. You had no right to go through my mail, research my debts, contact my creditors, and fix things without asking me." "No. I didn't ask for your help." "You didn't. So why?" He looked at her, and for the second time she saw something uncontrolled in his face, not the flash of vulnerability she'd glimpsed when Noah gave him the blanket, but something deeper, something that looked like a man confronting a question he'd been avoiding. "Because I've spent 20 years in a world where everything is leverage," he said. "Every favor is a debt. Every kindness is a transaction. Every relationship is a calculation. And then you pulled me off a road in the middle of nowhere and brought me into your home and treated me like a person. And your son..." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "Your son gave me his blanket. And he didn't want anything. He just saw someone who was cold." He looked down at his hands, which were resting on the table, palms flat, perfectly still. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who walks away from that unchanged. I'm not sure I am that man. And fixing your mortgage is the only language I have for saying what I don't know how to say." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she'd experienced since the night Caleb died. Not empty, full. Full of things unsaid and things understood. Full of the distance between two people who'd been shaped by completely different kinds of damage and were standing in a kitchen in a 30-foot trailer, trying to figure out whether the space between them was a bridge or a wall. I don't want to owe you, she said. You won't. You say that, but the world you come from doesn't work that way. In your world, there's always a debt. My world, he said, is exactly why I'm telling you there isn't one. Because I know what debts look like, and this isn't one. This is a man trying to do one thing. That doesn't have a price tag on it. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen light hummed. The trailer settled. Outside, the Oklahoma dark pressed against the windows like an audience. Thank you, she said, and this time the words cost her everything, and she gave them anyway. He nodded. And then, with the precise intuition of a man who knew when a room needed space, he stood and walked to the couch and lay down and turned his back to the kitchen, and Lily sat in the chair and put her head in her hands and breathed. She didn't cry, but she came close, closer than she'd come in months. The days that followed were the strangest of her life, stranger than the early days of grief, stranger than the night she found him, stranger even than the moment she'd learned who he was. Because nothing dramatic happened. Nothing changed in the way she'd braced herself for. No men with guns, no midnight confrontations, no moral reckonings. Instead, what happened was ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was what made it devastating. Matteo Rossi stayed in her home, and he was quiet, and he was careful, and he paid attention. He fixed the heating vent in Noah's room. She came home one afternoon to find him standing on a chair in the back bedroom, shirtless, his wound covered in a fresh bandage, his hands inside the vent panel, and the room, for the first time in as long as she could remember, was warm. He'd cleared a blockage in the ductwork, he said. Simple fix. Anyone could have done it, but no one had. He fixed the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for 6 months. He replaced the section of siding that the wind had been finding. He stabilized the back step, which had been wobbly since before Caleb died. He did these things without asking, without announcing, without expectation of thanks. He simply identified problems and solved them with the methodical efficiency of a man for whom solving problems was not a hobby, but a fundamental operating principle. And every evening, when Lily came home from her second shift, the kitchen was clean, and Noah's dinner had been made. Simple things: a grilled cheese, pasta with butter, and the fresh vegetables Matteo had bought. And Noah would run to the door and tell her about the card house they'd built, or the story Matteo had told him about a place called Napoli, where the buildings were the color of lemons, and the sea was so blue it hurt your eyes. Did he eat? She'd ask Mrs. Delgado, who she'd started dropping Noah off to later in the day, now that Matteo was there in the mornings. A fact she didn't think about too carefully, because thinking about it carefully would require confronting the question of whether she trusted a mafia boss with her child, and the answer to that question was complicated in ways she wasn't ready to examine. He ate everything, Mrs. Delgado would say, smiling. That man can cook. And Lily would stand in the doorway and nod and try to ignore the thing growing ins. Her chest, the thing that had no right to exist and yet grew anyway, fed by warm rooms and full refrigerators and the sound of her son laughing in the next room at something a dangerous man had said to make him smile. The break came on the 12th day. Lily was at the gas station, standing behind the register, watching an old man count out coins for a pack of cigarettes, when a black SUV pulled up to the pumps. Not unusual, black SUVs were as common in Oklahoma as pickup trucks, but something about this one made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Maybe it was the tinted windows, dark beyond legal limits. Maybe it was the plates, which were from out of state, Illinois. Maybe it was the two men who got out of it. They were big, not fat, big in the way that comes from purpose rather than excess. One was white, with a shaved head and a neck that was wider than his jaw. The other was dark-haired, Mediterranean-looking, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin. They were wearing jackets that were slightly too large, the kind of fit that accommodated what was underneath. And Lily had grown up around men who carried guns, and she knew what a concealed weapon looked like under a coat. They came inside. The white one went to the coffee station. The dark-haired one came to the register. He picked up a pack of gum and a Gatorade and set them on the counter. "Nice area," he said conversationally. His voice was flat, Accentless, in the way that meant the accent had been trained out. Quiet. Yes, sir. We're in town for a few days. Business. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Looking for some property. Might be building out here. You know the area. I've lived here most of my life. Maybe you can help us then. We're looking for a friend of ours. Italian guy. Mid-30s. He was supposed to meet us last week, but he never showed. We think he might have had some car trouble on one of these back roads. You hear anything about a man like that? Maybe someone new in town, staying at a motel, or... He paused, watching her face with the same kind of attention Matteo used. The kind that read micro-expressions the way most people read headlines. Maybe someone who needed help? Lily's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could see it in her throat. But she'd been lying to debt collectors and deflecting questions from concerned neighbors and telling her son that Daddy was watching from far away for over a year, and she'd gotten very good at keeping her face still when the inside of her chest was on fire. Can't say I have, she said. But you could check with the sheriff's office. They'd know about any accidents or hospital visits. The dark-haired man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, picked up his gum and Gatorade, and left a $20 bill on the counter. Keep the change, he said. And if you do hear anything about our friend, we're staying at the Patriot Motor Inn off Highway 20, room 12. We'd appreciate a call. They left. The black SUV pulled out of the lot and turned east toward Pauhuska. Lily stood behind the register and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the free prenatal class had taught her when she was pregnant with Noah, and the only thing she'd been scared of was childbirth. She picked up her phone and called the only number she had for the trailer, the landline she kept because it was included in her internet bundle, and she'd never disconnected it. It rang 4 times. 5. Matteo picked up. Don't say your name, she said. There were 2 men in the gas station. They're looking for an Italian man. Mid-30s. Car trouble on a back road. They're staying at the Patriot Motor Inn off Highway 20. The silence on the other end was absolute. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a machine, switching modes, transitioning from one operational state to another. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, colder. The voice, she realized, of the man he actually was. Describe them. She did. Every detail, the shaved head, the scar, the 2 large jackets, the Illinois plates, the flat voice, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. How long ago did they leave? 3 minutes. Which direction? East on 20. Another silence. Then, when does your shift end? 2. Go straight to Mrs. Delgado's. Pick up Noah. Don't come home. This is my home, Lily. His voice cut through hers like a blade through cloth, not angry, not threatening, but absolute. These men are not looking for a friend. They are looking for me so they can kill me, and if they find me in your home, they will kill you and your son too. Not because they need to, because that's how the message is sent. Do you understand? She understood. She understood in the cold, marrow-deep way that she'd understood the night the police came to tell her about Caleb. The understanding that arrives not as information, but as a change in the physical properties of reality, as if the air itself had become heavier, denser, harder to breathe. I understand, she said. Go to Mrs. Delgado's. Stay there. I'll handle this. What does handle mean? It means by tonight. Either they'll be gone or I will. The line went dead. She stood behind the register for the remaining 4 hours of her shift, and every car that pulled into the lot made her pulse spike, and every time the door opened, she looked up expecting to see the shaved head, or the scar, and by the time 2 o'clock came, she was vibrating with a tension so deep it felt geological, like fault lines shifting under the surface of her composure. She drove to Mrs. Delgado's. Noah was playing in the yard, bundled in his coat, chasing a cat that belonged to no one and everyone. He ran to her when he saw the truck, and she picked him up and held him so tight he squirmed. Mama, too tight. Sorry, baby, sorry. She carried him inside. Mrs. Delgado. Took one look at her face and put on the kettle. What happened? I need to stay here tonight, me and Noah. Can we do that? Mrs. Delgado didn't ask why. She was a woman who'd survived a husband's drinking and a son's deployment and the slow erosion of everything familiar, and she knew that when a woman showed up with that expression on her face, the questions could wait. Of course, mija, as long as you need. They stayed. Lily put Noah to bed in Mrs. Delgado's spare room, a space that smelled like lavender and mothballs and safety. And then she sat at the kitchen table with the old woman and drank tea and said nothing about the man on her couch, or the men at the gas station, or the bullet wound, or the encrypted phone, or any of it. She said nothing because saying it would make it real, and she needed it to not be real, just for tonight, just until the morning, when she would go home and either find Mateo gone or find him there, and either way, the next chapter of whatever this was would begin. Mrs. Delgado watched her, and the wisdom of old women is that they know when silence is a kindness, and she offered that kindness without being asked. At 2 in the morning, Lily's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Clear, come home. She read it 7 times. Then she lay down on the bed next to Noah and pressed her face against the back of his head, where his hair smelled like baby shampoo and dirt, and she closed her eyes and waited for morning. She went home at 7 a.m. The trailer looked the same. The truck was in the driveway. The sky was overcast, the plains gray and still. She carried Noah on her hip and walked to the front door and opened it. Mateo was sitting at the kitchen table. He was wearing Caleb's jacket. There was a cup of coffee in front of him, and there was blood on his knuckles. Not a lot, but enough. Is it over? She asked. For now. What does for now mean? It means those 2 specific men won't be looking for me anymore. But there will be others. Eventually. There are always others. She put Noah down. He ran to the couch, found his blanket, and began the process of building a fort out of cushions, the reliable, consuming business of being 3 years old. Lily sat across from Mateo. She looked at his knuckles. She looked at his face. He looked tired, not the physical exhaustion of the first few days, but a deeper weariness, the kind that lived in the bones and had nothing to do with sleep. What did you do? She asked. I made a call, a different call than the ones I've been making. I called someone I didn't want to owe, and I told them where the men were, and they were dealt with. Dealt with? They're alive, he said, reading the question she hadn't asked. They've been sent back with a message. I'm under protection now, a different kind of protection than I had before. It's temporary, but it'll hold long enough. Long enough for what? He looked at her. The morning light, came through the kitchen window and caught his face at an angle that made the scar on his jaw more visible. And she thought about scars, how they were the body's way of remembering damage, how they were proof that something terrible had happened, and the body had chosen to survive anyway. Well, long enough for me to make a decision, he said. About what? About whether I stay or go. The words dropped into the kitchen like stones into still water, and the ripples spread outward, through the table, the room, the trailer, the morning, the entire fragile architecture of her life. That's not your decision to make alone, she said. I know. They sat in the kitchen, and the coffee cooled, and Noah built his fort, and the wind blew across the plains, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of everything that had happened, and everything that might happen next. Full of the space between 2 people who had been brought together by violence, and held together by something they were both too careful to name. The next 3 days were a strange, suspended kind of peace, the kind of peace that exists in the eye of a storm, when the wind drops, and the sky clears, and everything is quiet, and you know in the part of you that listens to weather, that it isn't over. Mateo made breakfast. She couldn't stop him. He woke before she did, which required waking before 5:15, and by the time she came into the kitchen he'd have eggs and toast and coffee ready, everything clean, everything in order. He moved in the kitchen with the same controlled precision he applied to everything, cracking eggs one-handed, slicing bread in even pieces, pouring coffee without spilling a drop. You don't have to do this, she said every morning. I know, he said every morning. Noah had accepted his presence the way children accept everything, not as a fact to be questioned but as a condition of the world, like weather. Mateo was simply there. The way the couch was there, and the kitchen table was there, a feature of the environment that happened to build card houses and make grilled cheese and tell stories about a place where the buildings were yellow and the sea was impossibly blue. One morning Noah brought him the one-eyed bear. "His name is Captain," Noah said, presenting the bear with the solemnity of a diplomat offering credentials. "He's missing an eye. He got in a fight." Mateo took the bear with both hands. He examined it with genuine attention, turning it over, checking the stitching, noting the depleted stuffing and the remaining button eye. "He's a warrior," Mateo said. "He's scared of the dark," Noah clarified. "Warriors can be scared of the dark. That doesn't make them less brave." Noah considered this. "Are you scared of the dark?" Mateo looked at the boy, this small, open, impossibly brave creature, who gave his blanket to strangers and named his bears and asked questions that went straight through the armor of men who had spent decades building it. And something happened to his face. Something that Lily, watching from the hallway, would remember for the rest of her life. The mask he wore, the composed, controlled, unreadable surface that he presented to the world, cracked, not like a dam breaking, like ice in spring, a slow, irreversible thaw. "Sometimes," he said. "That's okay," Noah said. "Captain will protect you." And he placed the bear on the couch beside Mateo's pillow and went to find his crayons. Mateo sat very still. Lily saw him press his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose, a gesture she'd come to recognize as the one he used when he was suppressing something, holding something back, keeping something contained that wanted out. She went to the kitchen and started a second pot of coffee and didn't say anything, because sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for a person who is unraveling is to look away. That afternoon, while Noah was at Mrs. Delgado's and Lily was between shifts, she came home to change clothes and found Mateo on the back step again. But this time he wasn't looking at the planes. He was looking at a file, a physical file, paper, several pages thick, printed on the kind of stock that lawyers used. "What is that?" she asked. He closed the file. He didn't hide it. He wasn't that kind of evasive, but he closed it in the way a person closes a book when they're not ready to discuss what they've read. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The step was cold. The sky was that particular shade of winter gray that Oklahoma does better than anywhere. Not dramatic, not stormy, just gray, endlessly gray, like the sky had gotten tired and given up. "Your husband," he said. The word hit different coming from him. She'd heard it from lawyers and insurance adjusters and sympathetic neighbors, and it always sounded the same, soft, careful, the verbal equivalent of tiptoes. From Mateo, it sounded like what it was, a fact, a point of data, a starting position. What about him? The accident at the processing plant? The hydraulic press? What about it? He opened the file. She could see documents inside, photographs, copies of forms, something that looked like an engineering report. "I had someone look into it," he said. Her entire body went cold. Not the cold of the steppe or the wind, a different cold. The cold that comes from the inside, from the place where intuition lives. "You had no right." "I know, but I did it anyway, because I have resources you don't. And because the settlement you received was criminal, and because something about the way this was handled made me suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" He turned the file toward her. She looked at the first page, an engineering assessment, dated 6 weeks ago, commissioned by someone whose name she didn't recognize. "The hydraulic press that killed your husband was scheduled for maintenance months before the accident. The maintenance was never performed. The work order was filed and signed off as completed, but the actual service, the inspection and recalibration of the safety mechanisms, was never done. The signature on the work order belongs to a supervisor named Dean Cartwright." She knew the name. Dean Cartwright had been Caleb's shift supervisor. He'd been at the funeral. He'd shaken her hand and said he was sorry. Cartwright signed off on maintenance that never happened because the plant was under pressure from corporate to reduce downtime. The press was running 22 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing at a rate that exceeded its rated capacity. The safety interlock that should have prevented the press from cycling while the loading zone was occupied had been disabled, deliberately, manually, to speed up the process. The words entered her one at a time, each one a small, precise wound. The company knew the press was unsafe. Cartwright knew. His supervisor knew. Corporate knew. They calculated the risk and decided that the cost of a potential accident, including legal fees and a settlement, was lower than the cost of shutting down the line for maintenance. Your husband died because someone did math on a spreadsheet and decided his life was worth less than 12 hours of production. She was shaking, not dramatically. She was past dramatic reactions. She was shaking the way a bridge shakes when the load exceeds the design capacity, a deep structural tremor that came from the foundations. The settlement you received, the one that barely covered the funeral, was calculated to be the minimum amount necessary to make you go away. The lawyer you consulted was right that you had grounds for a negligence suit. What he didn't know was that the company's legal team had already identified you as a low-risk plaintiff. For young, broke, no family, no resources, no ability to sustain a prolonged legal battle. They offered you a number they knew you couldn't refuse because refusing it required money you didn't have. She took the file from his hands. She looked at the engineering report, the photographs, the work orders, the emails, printed emails between plant managers and corporate executives, discussing maintenance schedules and production targets and risk assessments that included the phrase acceptable loss parameters. Acceptable loss parameters. Her husband, Caleb, the man who'd fixed a wobbly table with a piece of cardboard and called it character. The man who'd won a stuffed bear at the state fair. The man whose son still asked if he was coming home. An acceptable loss. This is enough, Mateo said quietly. This is enough for a wrongful death suit that no company survives. Not a settlement. A judgment. The kind that changes outcomes. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd cried for Caleb in the weeks and months after his death. Cried until crying felt like just another bodily function, as routine and involuntary as breathing. She didn't have tears for this. What she had was something colder and harder and more useful. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because it's true, and because you deserve to know the truth. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking why you care. He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the plains, bending the brown grass in waves. In the distance, the bison preserve was a dark line against the gray. Because I've been responsible for terrible things, he said, and I've made peace with most of them, but I have never, not once, been responsible for what was done to your husband, what was done to you, the deliberate, calculated destruction of a man's life for profit, hidden behind paperwork and legal settlements, cleaned up by men in suits who never had to look at the woman they'd wrecked. That's not my kind of violence, and it's worse. It's worse because it pretends to be civilized. She held the file in her lap. It weighed almost nothing, a few sheets of paper, a few photographs. But it was the heaviest thing she'd ever held, because it contained the truth about the thing that had defined the last 14 months of her life. And the truth was exactly what she'd suspected in the dark, quiet hours when Noah was asleep and the debt was pressing in, and the story she'd been told about a workplace accident felt thin and insufficient, like a bandage over a wound that needed surgery. I need a lawyer, she said. You have one, a good one. He's already been briefed. He'll take the case on contingency. You arranged a lawyer for me? I arranged a consultation. The decision is yours. Everything from here is yours. She looked at the file again. Then she looked at him. The man on her back step, in her dead husband's jacket, with blood still faintly visible in the creases of his knuckles, who had come into her life bleeding and broken and had somehow, impossibly, given her back the thing she'd lost. Not Caleb, never Caleb, but the truth. The truth about what had been done to him. The truth about what had been done to her. Thank you, she said. And this time the words weren't enough, and they both knew it. And the space between them, 6 inches of cold Oklahoma steppe, was the smallest and the largest distance in the world. The crisis came 3 days later, on a Tuesday. Matteo was on his phone, the encrypted one, speaking in Italian, and his voice was different from any she'd heard from him before. Not cold, not controlled, strained. He was standing in the kitchen, his back to the hallway, one hand on the counter, and the tension in his body was visible even from behind. The rigid spine, the locked shoulders, the white-knuckle grip on the phone. She waited in the hallway until he hung up. "What happened?" He turned. His face was the mask again, composed, unreadable, but his eyes were different, harder, the eyes of the man he'd been before she'd found him, the man who controlled logistics routes through the Midwest and evaluated rooms for exits and treated the world as a series of threats to be assessed and neutralized. "The protection I arranged," he said, "it has conditions, and the conditions have changed." "Changed how?" "I was given time to recover. That time is up. The people I called, the ones who dealt with the 2 men, they want me back, in New York, by the end of the week." "Then go." He looked at her. The mask slipped, just for a second. A fracture through the composure, a glimpse of the man underneath, the one who built card houses and told stories about Napoli, and sat very still when a 3-year-old handed him a one-eyed bear. "If I go back," he said, "I go back to what I was. I step back into a machine that doesn't stop. The calls, the logistics, the operations, the people who want what I have, and the people who want me dead for having it. I go back to a life where no one gives me a blanket, where no one treats me like a person, where everything I do and everything I am is defined by power and leverage and the careful, constant management of violence. And if I stay, they'll come for me. Not the men from the gas station. Those were freelancers. The people who come next will be professionals, and they won't leave witnesses." The word hit her like a physical force. Witnesses. He meant her. He meant Noah. "Then there's no choice," she said. "You leave." "There's a third option." She waited. "I leave the organization. I transfer my operations to my second-in-command. I surrender my territory, my contacts, my roots. I walk away from everything I've built in 20 years and start over. New name, new location, new life." "Can you do that? Just walk away?" "Not without cost, and not without risk. The transition would take months. There are people who would see it as weakness, as opportunity. There would be a period, 6 months, maybe more, where I'd be vulnerable, where, anyone connected to me would be vulnerable." He was looking at her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel different. Charged, pressurized, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. "I'm telling you this because the decision involves you, not because I assume anything, not because I expect anything, but because whatever I decide will affect your life, and you have the right to be part of that decision." She leaned against the counter, the kitchen, the small, clean kitchen with the wobbling table and the working faucet and the fridge that was, for once, full of food, felt both fragile and solid, the way a home always feels when you're looking at it from the edge of something that could destroy it. "What do you want?" she asked. The question surprised him. She could see it, the flash of something behind the mask, the recalculation, the realization that no one had asked him that question in a very long time, maybe ever. In his world, people asked what he was going to do, what his orders were, what his strategy was. Nobody asked what he wanted. "I want to stay," he said. "Not here, not in this trailer, not in this exact configuration, but in this life, in a life where the kitchen is clean and the fridge is full, and a child brings me his bear because he thinks I'm scared of the dark." He paused. "I want to be the kind of man who deserves that. I don't know if I am. I don't know if I can be. But I want to try." She was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. Noah laughed in the other room. He was watching the cartoon she'd found on the old DVD player, the one with the singing animals, and his laughter came through the walls like sunlight through curtains, warm and unreasonable and impossible to argue with. "If you do this," she said, "if you walk away from that life, it has to be real. Not a vacation, not a break, not a temporary arrangement where you disappear for a while and then go back. If you stay, you stay. If you become someone new, you actually become someone new. Because I will not let Noah love someone who leaves. The word landed between them. Love. She hadn't meant to say it, or maybe she had. Maybe it had been building since the 6th day, when he'd fixed the heating vent and Noah's room was warm for the first time in a year. Maybe since the night he'd listened to Noah's nightmares and hadn't moved from the couch. Maybe since the moment on the road, when she'd seen his eyes in the headlights and known, in some pre-rational part of herself, that this man's life was tangled up with hers in a way she couldn't undo. "I won't leave," he said. "Don't say that unless you mean it." "I have never," he said with a quiet ferocity that she felt in her sternum, "said anything I didn't mean." The moment hung there, fragile, enormous, terrifying in its simplicity. Two people in a kitchen making a decision that would change both their lives, with nothing to guide them except the improbable, irrational, undeniable fact that they had found each other on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere, and the world, despite its best efforts, had not managed to pull them apart. He made the call that night. She didn't hear the conversation. He went outside, into the cold, and stood on the back step and spoke in Italian for 45 minutes, and when he came back inside, his face was different, not the mask, not the vulnerability underneath, something new, something she'd never seen on him before. Relief. "It's done?" she asked. "It started. It'll take time, months. There are protocols, transitions, people who need to be managed. But it started." "Yes," she nodded. She poured him coffee. He sat at the table and wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at her with an expression that was so open, so unguarded, so completely unlike anything she'd seen from him in the 2 weeks she'd known him, that for a moment he looked like a completely different person, not Matteo, the logistics boss, not Michael Torres, the fake New Yorker, not the man who evaluated rooms for exits and spoke in Italian on encrypted phones, just a man, tired, hopeful, scared, human. "Mama," Noah called from the living room. Captain fell behind the couch. Lily looked at Matteo. He looked at her. "I'll get it," he said, and he stood and walked to the living room and knelt beside the couch and fished out the one-eyed bear and handed it to the boy who had given him a blanket when he had nothing, and the boy said, "Thank you," and the man said, "You're welcome." And Lily stood in the kitchen doorway and watched and let the crack in her chest finally open, and what came through was not pain. It was the beginning of something, not a fairy tale, not a rescue, not a billionaire fantasy where the powerful man swoops in and fixes everything with money and muscle. It was smaller than that, and harder, and more real. It was two broken people in a small house on the edge of nothing, choosing each other not because it was easy or safe or smart, but because the alternative, turning away, driving past, leaving the other one in the cold, was something neither of them could do. It was a beginning, and that was enough. The months that followed were not easy. Nothing about any of this was easy, and if this story pretended otherwise, it would be a different kind of lie than the one the insurance company had told Lily about her husband's death, but a lie nonetheless. Matteo's transition out of his old life was exactly as complicated as he'd predicted. There were phone calls at odd hours, conversations in Italian that left him tight-jawed and silent for hours afterward. There were trips, short ones, to cities she didn't ask about, where he'd leave for 2 or 3 days and come back looking older. Not physically older. Older in the way that people age when they're dismantling something they spent a lifetime building, but he always came back. He came back to the trailer on the Oklahoma plains, to the wobbling kitchen table and the repaired heating vent, and the boy who left a one-eyed bear on his pillow every night, because he believed, with the unshakable conviction of a 3-year-old, that everyone deserved protection from the dark. The legal case against Brewer Industrial moved forward. The lawyer Matteo had found, a sharp-eyed woman from Tulsa named Carmen Okafor, who specialized in wrongful death litigation, and who had, Lily suspected, been briefed on exactly who Mateo was, and had decided to take the case anyway, filed the suit in March. The engineering report, the work orders, the emails about acceptable loss parameters, all of it went into the filing, and the company's legal team, which had calculated Lily as a low-risk plaintiff, realized very quickly that the calculation had changed. The company settled. Not the way they'd settled before, not the insulting, predatory, take-this-and-go-away number they'd offered a grieving 22-year-old. This settlement had 6 figures, and it came with a public admission of negligence, and it came with a mandate to overhaul the safety protocols at every plant the company operated, and it came with a fund established in Caleb Harper's name for the families of other workers who'd been killed or injured by cost-cutting measures. It didn't bring Caleb back. Nothing would bring Caleb back. But it meant that his death was not invisible. It meant that someone had looked at the math on the spreadsheet and said, "This is wrong." It meant that the next man on the night shift would not die the way Caleb had died, alone, in the dark, killed by a machine that should have been serviced and a corporation that should have cared. With the settlement money, Lily paid off the trailer. She didn't buy a new house, not yet. She wasn't ready for yet. She bought new tires for the truck. She bought Noah a bed with a real frame. She put the rest in savings because she'd learned in the hardest possible way that the distance between stability and disaster was measured in months, not years, and she would never again be one missed paycheck away from losing her home. She kept her job at the diner, not the gas station. She quit the fuel and go, not because she didn't need the money, but because 16-hour days were not a life, and she was learning slowly to tell the difference between surviving and living. Mateo got a job. This, more than anything else in the entire improbable story of how they'd come together, was the thing that made Lily laugh. Not a bitter laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and surprises you with its existence. He went to work for a construction company, not Prescott. Prescott had rerouted their development away from Lily's property and was building their residential community 3 miles east. The company Mateo joined was smaller, local, run by a man named Jim Blackhorse, who built houses the way they should be built. Solid, square, with foundations that went deep and roofs that didn't leak. Mateo, it turned out, knew things about construction. He knew about materials and logistics and supply chains. He knew how to negotiate with vendors and schedule crews and read a blueprint. He knew how to make things work. What he doesn't know about houses, Jim told Lily once, leaning against his truck at a site barbecue. You could fit in a thimble, but what he knows about getting things done could fill a warehouse. I don't know where you found him, but he's the best foreman I've ever had. Lily smiled and said nothing, because the true answer, I found him bleeding on a road in the dark, was not the kind of thing you said at barbecues. Mateo's new name was Marco Torres, not Michael. He'd retired Michael Torres with the fake New York license, but Marco. It was close enough to his real name that he'd respond to it instinctively, which mattered, and far enough from his old life that a routine background check wouldn't raise flags. The identity had been created with the kind of thoroughness that suggested professional help, a social security number, a work history, a credit record, all of it backstopped and verified, all of it real enough to withstand scrutiny. He never told her exactly how this had been arranged, and she never asked. There were parts of his old life that existed behind a door she'd chosen not to open, and that was a decision she revisited periodically and always arrived at the same conclusion. She didn't need to know everything. She needed to know who he was now, and who he was now was a man who woke up early and made breakfast and drove to a construction site and came home with sawdust in his hair and read stories to a boy who called him Teo, because Mateo was too many syllables for a 3-year-old's priorities. Noah called him Teo, not Dad. Lily was clear about that, and Mateo understood without being told, the way he understood most things about her, with a perceptiveness that was both a gift and a remnant of his training. Caleb was Noah's father. Caleb would always be Noah's father. The settlement fund bore Caleb's name. The photograph on Noah's nightstand, The one where Caleb was holding Noah as a baby, grinning, his whole face lit up with the terrified joy of new fatherhood. Stayed where it was. Mateo never moved it, never mentioned it, never positioned himself as a replacement. He was something else, something that didn't have a name yet, because the language for what they were, this strange, careful, hard-won thing, hadn't been invented by people who'd lived conventional lives. The romance between them was slow, slow the way rivers carve canyons, not in a rush of dramatic force but in the steady, patient application of presence. Mine, they didn't fall into each other, they moved toward each other day by day, in increments so small they were almost imperceptible, except that one morning, Lily woke up and realized she was no longer listening for the sound of his breathing, to make sure he was still there. She was listening because the sound of his breathing had become the thing that told her she was home. He touched her for the first time on a Thursday in April. Not sexually. She was carrying groceries in from the truck, and he took the bags from her hands, and his fingers brushed hers, and they both went still. It was the smallest possible physical contact, a fraction of a second, the tips of his fingers against the backs of her knuckles, and it went through her like electricity, like a shock, not because it was intense, but because it was the first time in 14 months that anyone had touched her, and the touch hadn't come from a child or a debt collector, or the accidental contact of strangers in a crowded diner. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing in the driveway in the April light, and the plains were green for the first time in months, and somewhere in the distance the bison were moving across the grass in their slow, ancient, massive way, and the world was, for one impossible moment, exactly as it should be. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. And that was it. That was the beginning of the beginning, the first thread of something that would take months more to weave into anything solid, because both of them were damaged in ways that made trust a process rather than a decision, and because Lily would not give herself to anyone who had not first proven, through time and patience and the accumulation of small, reliable choices, that they would stay. But he stayed. He stayed through the spring, when Noah turned 4 and they had a birthday party in the yard with Mrs. Delgado and Jim Blackhorse and a few families from the trailer park, and Mateo grilled hamburgers and Noah blew out candles, and the evening was so normal, so utterly ordinary, that Lily had to step inside for a moment to breathe through the wave of feeling that crashed through her, because this was what she'd wanted, what she'd always wanted, not a savior, but a partner, not a fairy tale, but a Tuesday night with a birthday cake, and someone who stood at the grill and called her name to ask if she wanted cheese on her burger. He stayed through the summer, when the heat turned the plains brown again, and the cicadas screamed in the evenings, and they sat on the back step and watched the sun set behind the bison preserve and didn't talk, because they'd reached the point where silence between them was not an absence of words, but a form of conversation, a language they'd developed together, made of proximity and trust and the slow, careful dissolution of the walls they'd each built to survive. He stayed through the fall, when the lawyer filed the final paperwork on the Brewer Industrial Settlement, and Lily signed the documents at Carmen Okafor's office in Tulsa, and on the drive home, she pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat in the truck and cried, not because she was sad, because it was over, because Caleb's death had been accounted for, because justice, imperfect, incomplete, not enough, but something, had been done. And Mateo sat in the passenger seat and didn't touch her, and didn't speak, and didn't try to fix it, because he understood that some grief needs to be witnessed, not repaired. He stayed. And one night in late October, with the first cold of the season coming through the windows, and Noah asleep in his warm room with Captain the One-Eyed Bear and the photograph of his father on the nightstand, Lily stood in the hallway and looked at the man sleeping on her couch. The couch that was too short for him, that had always been too short for him, that he'd been sleeping on for 9 months without complaint, and she made a decision. Mateo. He woke instantly. The old reflexes, The hair-trigger alertness of a man who'd spent decades sleeping with one eye open. But when he saw her standing in the hallway, the tension left his body, and his face did the thing it did only for her and for Noah. It softened. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She stood there for a moment, in Caleb's flannel. She still wore it. She'd always wear it. It was part of who she was. And then she said, "The couch is too short for you." He looked at her. In the dark, his eyes were unreadable, but his breathing changed. And she heard it because she'd been listening to his breathing for months, and she knew what each rhythm meant. "I know," he said. "You could sleep somewhere else." The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. 4. The trailer was quiet. The wind was quiet. Everything was holding its breath. "Are you sure?" he asked. And his voice was different, stripped of everything but the question, raw in a way she'd never heard from him, vulnerable in a way that would have been unthinkable from the man she'd found on the road. "I'm sure." He stood. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And he looked at her face in the dark with the same careful attention he'd given everything since the day he arrived. The wound, the room, the exits, the child, the woman, except now it wasn't assessment. It was something else entirely. He raised his hand and touched her face. His fingers were rough from the construction work, calloused at the tips, and they rested against her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about his hands and what they'd done. "Lily," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss, not a cinematic sweeping off her feet moment. It was careful and slow and precise, the way he did everything, and it tasted like coffee and cold air and the beginning of something that would take the rest of their lives to finish. She took his hand and led him down the hallway, and the door closed behind them, and the trailer was quiet. And outside, the wind moved across the Oklahoma plains the way it had always moved, ancient, indifferent, eternal, and the bison slept in their dark fields, and the stars burned in their fixed and distant places, and in a small house on the edge of nothing. 2 people who had been broken by the world held each other in the dark and began, slowly, carefully, with all the courage and terror of people who know what it costs to love something you can lose, to build a life. Not a perfect life, not a fairy tale life, a real life, with a wobbling kitchen table, and a one-eyed bear, and a mortgage that was current, and a fridge that was full, and a boy who was growing up strong and brave and kind in a warm room his mother had insisted on, and a stranger had fixed. A life that had been born in the cold and the dark, on a road where no one was supposed to find anyone, where a woman who had every reason to drive past had stopped, and a man who had every reason to die had lived, and the distance between them, the vast, impossible distance between a widow in a trailer and a mafia boss bleeding in a ditch, had collapsed under the weight of the simplest, oldest, most dangerous thing in the world: compassion. Not the soft, sentimental kind, not the kind that asks nothing and risks nothing, the hard kind. The kind that sees a man dying in the cold and says, "This is going to cost me," and kneels down anyway. The kind that gives a blanket to a stranger because he might be cold. The kind that fixes a heating vent because a child shouldn't sleep in a cold room. The kind that researches a dead man's accident because his widow deserves the truth. The kind that costs everything. The kind that's worth it. This is the story of Lily Harper and Matteo Rossi. It is not a love story, though love is in it. It is not a crime story, though crime is in it. It is a story about what happens when the worst of the world collides with the best of it. In a small house on the Oklahoma plains, under a sky so big it makes everything else seem possible, even starting over, even being saved, even against all odds and evidence and reason, being happy. The wind blows, the bison graze, the boy grows, the woman stands, the man stays, and the road goes on.